Did you hear that I started my own private practice last year? It was a big change that is going to require more changes in 2026, like some home renovation to create a real home office to replace my desk in our living room. Managing your money doesn't have to be a struggle this year. Monarch is the all-in-one personal finance tool designed to make your life easier. It brings your entire financial life, budgeting, account and investments, net worth, and future planning together in one dashboard on your laptop or phone. Start your new year on the right foot financially and get 50% off your Monarch subscription with code OFFTHECLOCK. Want a financial reset after all of that holiday spending? Monarch makes it easy to make a fresh financial start in 2026. I know I'm ready to review holiday spending and set fresh budgets for a financially fit 2026. I'm not a fan of New Year's resolutions because of how easy it is to quit new habits by February, but Monarch helps you reach concrete, achievable goals you'll stick to for all 12 months of the year. This new year, achieve your financial goals for good. Monarch is the all-in-one tool that makes proactive money management simple all year long. Use code OFFTHECLOCK at monarch.com for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarch.com with code OFFTHECLOCK.
Meaning was sometimes challenging for people in grief because somehow the way meaning is served in our modern world, our reaction is often like, there's no meaning in a horrible death. There's no meaning in a bad divorce. There's no meaning in a murder. For us to understand, the meaning is not in the horrible event. The meaning is who do we become after it? What meaning can we find? And it's actually about excavating the pain so that the meaning gets revealed underneath.
That was David Kessler on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Mac Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Want to level up your podcast feed in the new year? If you love Psychologists Off the Clock, you need the Behavioral Grooves podcast. Great behavioral science, real-world applications, fun co-host conversations, and insights that actually improve your work and home life. Find Behavioral Grooves wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey everybody, it's Jill here, and I am so thrilled about my guest today. We have a real treat. I am interviewing David Kessler today. David Kessler is one of the world's foremost experts on loss and healing. His decades of experience with thousands of people on the edge of life and death has taught him the secrets to living a happy and fulfilled life, even after life's tragedies. He is the author of 7 books, including his latest best-selling book, Finding Meaning, The 6th Stage of Grief, which we are here to discuss today. He co-authored 2 books with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Life Lessons and On Grief and Grieving. He co-wrote You Can Heal Your Heart with Louise Hay, and also wrote Visions, Trips, and Crowded Rooms, Who and What You See Before You Die. His first book, The Needs of the Dying, received praise from Mother Teresa. His article in the Harvard Business Review titled The Discomfort You Are Feeling is Grief went viral and was named one of the most influential and innovative articles from Harvard Business Review's first century. His talk with Brené Brown was the #1 podcast in the world. David has a unique place in pop culture as one of his books being the premise for the season premiere of The Walking Dead, and he was a question on Alex Trebek's Jeopardy! His new online model of grief support, Tender Hearts, offers over 25 groups. Additionally, David leads one of the most respected grief educator certification programs, and he is the founder of Grief.com. David, welcome to Psychologists Off the Clock. I'm so thrilled to have you here with me today.
I'm so glad to be with you. I hear that intro, and all I can think is pretty good for a kid who dropped out of school.
Pretty good for a kid who
Like in
dropped
the
out of
ninth grade,
school.
I dropped out of school. So I'm like, oh, okay, I ended up doing all right.
You sure did. Well, let's start there with your story. So I was sharing with you before we hit record that when I read Finding Meaning, oh my gosh, I'm already getting choked up just talking about it. This is one of the most beautiful books I have ever read. I read it at a time where I really was not struggling with any loss, and it still just touched me so deeply. And I have since gifted it to every person that I've known who has suffered with a loss. And you start that book by sharing your own personal story. And, I think a lot of people must wonder, why on earth would you want to go into this field of grief and death and dying? It just feels so dark and heavy and challenging. So can you start by sharing a little bit about the answer to that question and your story?
Yeah, it's very true. I often say it's not a profession that I chose as much as it chose me. I had a really challenging childhood. There was neglect and addiction and mental illness. There was a lot going on. And then when I was 13, my mother was really sick. I didn't realize she was dying at the time. She had to go to the hospital in the big city, and which was a few hours away. And we were at a hotel across the street, and I couldn't visit her. You had to be 14. I was 13. I spent lots of time in the hospital lobby and then was spending time in the hotel lobby. And one day, folks started screaming at the hotel, "Fire, fire." We all ran out. There was a fire up on the 18th floor, and the fire trucks came. They extended the ladders, and then suddenly shooting began. It turned out to be one of the first mass shootings in the U.S. I watched police officers, first responders, hotel guests, so many shots and deaths that happened. And my father desperately was trying to get us back to the hospital, which we eventually did safely. And then a couple of days later, my mother died. I wasn't able to be with her when she died. And it was a lot of grief and trauma. And I just came out of it so broken and damaged. And my father didn't know how to be a parent. I ended up dropping out of the ninth grade, as I mentioned. And I just remember wandering the streets, just walking, days on end walking for probably a couple of years. And thank goodness I had a neighbor, and I always talk about it only takes one person. I had a neighbor who said to me, "You're really smart. You should go back to school." And I said, "I can't. I'd be too old now. It's too late." And she said, "Oh, you can challenge your high school diploma. Just go challenge it and take the test, and then you can go to community college for free." And I was like, "Oh." And sure enough, I went and challenged my high school diploma. I enrolled in community college. I heard there were two easy classes, one that everyone wanted to take on sex, and the other one that people didn't want to take was on death and dying. And before I even made a choice, which wouldn't have been much of a choice for me, I found out the sex class was full. So everyone is going into the death and dying class. And I learned about this woman, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who had written this book on death and dying and about these stages. And all of a sudden, there was a language for what I had been feeling.
Yeah.
And it's very strange to say this out loud. Sounds weird, but I think it says a lot. I was sure I was the only child that ever had a parent die. Like, everyone else had alive parents. I thought this is something that only happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
And talk about personalization. And then suddenly, not only was I in this class learning this language, but there were other people in this class who had had loved ones die. And it changed everything. Little did I know I'd be writing and working with this amazing icon.
Yeah, it's incredible. And you said the title that you have is a thanatologist.
Yeah, I'm trained as a bioethicist. Some people call it a thanatologist, which is the study of death and grief. I tend to just go with grief specialist.
Yeah, and you've said you've worked in hospitals and crime scenes and with plane crashes and all sorts of different things. And of course, with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and those 5 stages. And then you identified this 6th stage that we'll talk about in depth today. But I think it's really interesting. Of course, we all experience losses to death, of course, but also other significant losses. And yet you made this statement in your book that grief is optional. Can you explain what you mean when you say that?
Sure. First of all, grief being optional is this idea of we don't have to grieve this lifetime. We can skip grief. We just would have to skip attaching. We'd have to skip love. We'd have to skip connection. And I don't want to take this journey without love and connection. So if we love and connect, we're going to have grief.
So how do you define grief? I think that's actually an even better place to start. And especially, is grief only related to death, or do we call it grief with losses like divorce or a loss of job or something like that?
We all think, just as you said, that grief relates to death, but I also define it as a change we didn't want. And so it's always the death of something. So for instance, a breakup is the death of a romantic relationship in that form. A divorce is the death of the marriage. A job loss is the death of that paycheck with those people. So they're all losses. We can also have the loss of oneself. That's one of the few losses we can change, that we can find ourselves again, luckily, but that happens with many illnesses, neglect that may have happened to us, a lot of different things, narcissism, addiction, where we just had to, not form ourselves. And later we can do that again, luckily.
Yeah. Or I even think about the loss of hope. So my mom and I in life had a very complicated relationship, and I knew that it was never going to be the relationship I wanted it to be. I logically knew that. And yet, when she passed, it almost felt like the bigger grief wasn't the loss of her. It was the loss of the hope that we'll ever have the relationship that I wanted us to have, right? Even though logically I knew it was never going to happen, there must have still been that little girl wish inside that maybe someday, and death was the one thing that meant never.
Yeah, we do often hope to repair.
Yeah.
To finally get it right, to finally get it working. And boy, when death comes, it is that moment you go, oh, this was that journey this lifetime. And I'm going to have to figure a way to accept it as it was. And I often, when I work with people, often talk about we have to grieve the person we had. And we also have to grieve the idealized, like in your case, the idealized mother you didn't get this lifetime,
right,
that you deserved.
Yeah, exactly. The other question that you talk about being asked a lot is, how long will I grieve? And that's so relatable. It's so painful. People just want to know, when is this going to end? And I'm sure they hope you say, 6 months, you'll be good to go. And of course, that's never going to be the answer. So how do you field that question?
Oh my gosh. In my online groups now, people come on and the first thing they want is me to get them out of the pain. And I have to say, oh my gosh, I wish I had that magic wand. And the only way out of the pain is through the pain. But, when people say, how long is my grief going to last? How long is my sister's grief going to last? I always say, well, how long's the person going to be dead? Because if they're going to be dead a long time, you're going to grieve a long time. Now, that doesn't mean we will always grieve with pain. Hopefully, to me, the goal of grief work is to remember with more love than pain, but we have to do that in our own time and in our own way.
Yeah, like you'll always have the memory of that lost person, but you also talk about how hope and meaning are tied together, and those are two things that can change. So the loss of hope and meaning certainly do not have to be permanent, and that those are things that can shift in positive ways over time throughout that grieving process. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah. And of course, many times I have people come in and they're like, I'm so lost. And it's been a month or 2 months or 3 months or 6 months. And I have no purpose and I have no hope. And my response is, well, of course not. Of course not. Where you're at, of course not. I would be shocked if someone in 3 months really has everything back together. And so many times, like with hope, I'll say, your loved one's death, just so brutal. I'm so sorry to hear about that. And their physical death is permanent. Your loss of hope is temporary.
Yeah.
And I will hold hope for you. I have hope for you until you can find it again.
I love that. That's beautiful. Now that the holidays are over, I am feeling the financial hangover. If you are too, Mint Mobile is here to help you cut back on overspending on wireless this January with 50% off unlimited premium wireless. Mint Mobile's end of the year sale is still going on, but only until the end of the month. So cut out Big Wireless's bloated plans and unnecessary monthly charges with 50% off 3, 6, or 12 months of unlimited. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. This January, quit overspending on wireless with 50% off unlimited premium wireless. Plans start at just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/POTC. That's mintmobile.com/POTC. Limited time offer. Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12 months required. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. Capable device required. Availability, speed, and coverage varies. See mintmobile.com.
As a therapist in private practice, I love seeing my clients, but don't love the administrative hassle. That's why whenever I give advice to a therapist starting their own practice, I recommend Simple Practice. Simple Practice is an all-in-one EHR that is HIPAA compliant, high-trust certified, and built specifically for therapists. I've been using it since I started my own private practice years ago. It helps me streamline everything. I send each new client a link, and then Simple Practice is my portal for consent forms, billing, appointment reminders, even my telehealth video platform. It makes running a practice so much easier because it frees up time for me to do the important stuff, seeing my clients. And I'm not the only POTC co-host who uses it. Emily does too, and Jill uses it to manage her group practice. If you're just starting out or growing your practice, there's also a credentialing service that takes the headache out of insurance enrollment, which honestly can be a huge lift. Simple Practice is trusted by over 250,000 health and wellness professionals, and you can feel that in how thoughtfully it's built for our work. If you're ready to simplify the business side of your practice, now is the perfect time to try Simple Practice. Start with a 7-day free trial, then get 50% off your first 3 months. Just go to simplepractice.com to claim the offer. Again, that's simplepractice.com.
And let's talk about the meaning piece, which of course, this is your most recent book. As I mentioned at the top, it is gorgeous. And it's essentially adding this 6th stage of grief to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's grief model that you mentioned. So can we do a brief refresher of those stages of grief? I imagine most people listening know what they are, but will you just talk briefly about those?
Here's what has happened over the years. If folks go back and read her original work, she talks about they're not linear. Then her and I talked about how people were trying to reduce her stages of dying for stages of grief and make them 5 easy steps. And we formally adapted them together in a book we wrote together years ago on grief and grieving. And on page 1, literally on page 1, we say they're not linear. There's no one right model. There's no one right way to do grief. And I can't tell you how over the years people have said to me, I've got issues with those steps. I said, well, we agree with you on page 1 if you open the book.
Right.
But the media has always wanted to reduce them to 5 easy steps. And it's interesting. Even on my social media, sometimes people will go, you and Kubler-Ross are just trying to neaten up our grief. And I'm like, gosh, if you knew me and Kubler-Ross, neither of us would be described as neat. And grief is not something we can neaten up. It's actually pretty messy.
Yeah.
And I can go through those stages, all of them in an hour, and then start again. And if the stage model isn't right for you, then, one, it's interesting. It's sort of, in our world, we're always discussing which is the right model. But when I'm working with people in grief, they're never saying, I need a model.
Right.
So, the model, some people it works for, some people it doesn't. I would say what I've seen over the years is people who often have wounds around authority will be like, don't tell me how to grieve. You don't know me, and da-da-da. And I tell everyone, you're your own grief expert. So, grief is organic. I say we come from a long line of dead people. Every ancestor we've ever known has gone through this. So, it's organically in us.
I feel like there are so many things in life where the emotional response is kind of clean. Whereas with grief, there are so many different, just such a wide variety of emotional experiences. And I think those stages just give a helpful framework to understand that there is this complex set of very different emotions that you may experience.
And I would completely agree with you that I always say grief has many colors and many emotions, from jealousy and bitterness and a million ones we don't talk about to the basic things. And I find what's really helpful about the stages is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did not invent something. She profoundly observed something, like watching the sun going, it seems to come up on the east and it seems to set in the west. And she said, as I watch people dealing with death and dealing with grief, they seem to go through this, I can't believe this is happening. The denial, the disbelief. They may feel angry. That's obviously the anger. All the what ifs and if onlys are the bargaining. And then there's the depression. And it's important to note, in Kubler-Ross's time, depression and sadness were used more interchangeably. Now we don't use the word sadness. Someone will go, oh my gosh, we were all at lunch and we got really bad news and we were so depressed, but we were fine afterwards. And I'm like, wow, you came out of your depression in an hour? Did you go through a drive-through clinic? What did you do? But we don't say, oh, we were so sad now. And acceptance, I think the big myth around acceptance that Kubler-Ross and I used to talk about is there was a sense of finality and a sense of one big acceptance that you would find. And it doesn't work like that. There's many, many, many acceptances we have. We have an acceptance to plan the funeral, to show up at the funeral, to sign the divorce papers. There's a lot of acceptances we may have to deal with. It's not one big one like, oh, it was in the top drawer. I didn't look there. That's where it was. And, this leads to the meaning part of this, that as you know, or anyone knows who read the book, I, 9 years ago, after working in this field for decades, I get that call. No parent ever wants to get the call that my younger son, David, had died. And, oh my gosh, I was on the floor. I didn't think I could get up. And it was just brutal. And at times still is. And it was interesting. People would say, what's it like for the grief expert to have had a son die? And my response would always be, the grief expert didn't lose a son, the father did.
Yeah.
And oh my gosh, I had to do the stuff that I told everyone to do. One of the things I really learned is I used to hand out, go see a counselor, go to a grief group like I was handing out candy. No big deal. Just go do this, just go do that. I can't tell you, I could not find a counselor. I could not get myself to a grief group. It took me 3 times to walk into the grief group. And then I'd taken my contacts out. I had glasses on. I had a cap. And I sat down in this grief group and my books were 5 feet away on a table.
Oh, wow.
And I couldn't tell anyone, that's me. I'm that guy. I had to be the father that had to bury a child.
Yeah.
And I think, so now when people show up for a grief or anything, I applaud because I now get how hard it is to show up for ourselves in life and in grief.
Yeah.
And, I also wanted to write every parent I'd counsel and say, oh my gosh, I didn't get how bad the pain was. Just to be in that epicenter.
I remember you saying in the book something, I thought I got it. And then it happened to me. And I realized wow, you just really, it's unimaginable. It's truly unimaginable. Do you have a sense of what it was specifically that got in the way of you being able to show up to the grief group?
I didn't want it to be real. I didn't want to have to belong to that club of bereaved parents. Even when I eventually went to a counselor, a grief counselor, I walked in and I sat down across from her and she said to me, I would imagine it must feel like you're in the wrong chair. I didn't want to be the griever. I was the helper.
So there's another example. You said there are many acceptances that we have to go through. And that's a good example of that too. I mean, even just to get help involves a certain level of that acceptance stage.
Right.
Yeah.
Or at least claiming, the reality of where we are and who we are and what we're going through.
Yeah. And that makes me think, when you were talking about the stages not being linear, that they also probably aren't even mutually exclusive. You might be accepting the reality that this person is gone while still feeling angry and depressed and disbelieving. And I mean, I imagine they can all kind of coexist at the same
overlap
time.
Everything.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And so you also talk about how you have to reach acceptance before you get to the meaning part. So let's talk a little bit about that and what this stage, this meaning stage, how did you come to create this? Where did this dawn on you?
Well, I was home with lots of time, and it's interesting. I always had that voice, my own grief expert voice, and I could hear me telling people over the years, free time is not always your friend. I mean, many times grief seems to heal. And by healing, just to define that word for folks, because people in grief often don't like healing because they think it means moving on or forgetting. To me, healing means the event no longer controls us. I don't live from my son's death anymore. I don't make decisions from my son's death. We don't make decisions from the divorce. We don't live from the divorce. The event doesn't control us, to me, is what healing begins to look like.
But it doesn't mean you're no longer in pain or that you no longer miss this person.
No, you might still miss them. You might still be in pain. And I don't know anyone who's healed, with an ED, healed. I think we're all healing. And that was sort of the journey that I was on. And as I looked at the acceptance, I thought, is this it? I'm just going to accept he's gone and that's it. And I was like, it can't be the end. And then I thought about Kubler-Ross and I always talking about acceptance doesn't have a finality to it. And I remember picking up when I was just sitting at home, this chapter that I had written on meaning and grief. And I remember the first time I glanced at it, I went, yeah, that's going to help. And then I looked at it about a week later and I read it, and it didn't take the pain away, but it gave it a cushion.
Hmm.
And I went back and read Viktor Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning, and began to look at meaning. And meaning was sometimes challenging for people in grief because somehow the way meaning is served in our modern world, our reaction is often like, there's no meaning in a horrible death. There's no meaning in a bad divorce. There's no meaning in a murder. How would you think there's meaning? And for us to understand the meaning is not in the horrible event. The meaning is who do we become after it? What meaning can we find? And the one challenging thing about the book, as I often say, I might even change the title if I could, because people all the time say to me, oh, I saw your book, Finding Meaning. I'm not ready. And it's actually a book about excavating the pain so that the meaning gets revealed underneath. So I think there is something about understanding you can't bypass the pain. I'm like going to get to meet. Nope, you can't bypass it. You have to really start there, working through the pain, and then the meaning gets revealed.
I love that. You brought up Viktor Frankl, and I'm remembering back to, and you talk about him in the book. And of course, he talks about how, we choose our response even in life's most challenging moments. And of course, he's talking about his own experience being in a Nazi death camp. And so how is it that you relate those two things? And the other thing that comes to mind is, I think it was a friend of yours had this metaphor about, it was like swimming in a pool, like sinking to the depths.
It was my friend, Diane Gray. She was a bereaved mother herself and also was heading up the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation at the time. And she called me and she said, I know you feel like you're sinking. I know you feel like you're going down. And she said, you're going to go down for a while. And she said, at some point, you're going to hit a bottom and you're going to have a decision to make. Do you stay there or do you swim again?
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, I had this vision. I live in a little small, cute neighborhood with these little small houses. And I could see 20 years in the future, the kids riding by on their bikes and the new kid says, hey, what's that house that looks haunted with the cobwebs? And they would say, oh, that's a grief expert. And then his son died and he never leaves the home again. I could see that future. And I could see that I would have to make a decision towards that future or away from that future.
Yeah. You either push off the bottom.
Push off the bottom, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I wrote this down too. You said, I think it was around that same spot, that grief may not get smaller, but you must get bigger.
Yeah, we think like we're going to make our grief like go away and make it small. And my experience is it doesn't. I have to become bigger. I can't just go through it. I have to grow through it.
Yeah.
And, that's part of the meaning is that, we often all talk about post-traumatic stress. Meaning really is post-traumatic growth. And it happens more than post-traumatic stress, but we don't give it the airtime.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. Well, literally, it's funny you say that because I'm developing a new podcast right now that is for truth tellers, basically, people who have experienced trauma or been a victim of crime, for them to sort of share their story of post-traumatic growth, but specifically when speaking up has come at great cost. If you think about somebody like Christine Blasey Ford, who stood up in those hearings against Judge Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and it completely ruined her life. But when she was asked, do you regret it if you had to do it all over again? Would you do it? And she said, yes. Staying quiet would have been easier for me. It would have been easier in general. It would have been easier for my family, but it also would have been easier for him. And I owed it to myself to do that work. And, her whole memoir is essentially a memoir of post-traumatic growth. And I think, sharing stories and bravely speaking up when we live in a world that's trying very hard to keep us small and keep us silent is such a big part of that growth. And I wonder if that's true with grief too. The sense of community and sharing, if that helps boost the meaning and the post-traumatic growth.
Well, we absolutely need community.
Yeah.
We need connection. Now, the challenge is grief can feel isolating.
Yeah.
And we can become isolated. And I also have people all the time that say to me, oh my gosh, my loved one's isolating. My sister, my brother, they're isolating. They're in grief. What can I do? And I say, what do you do now? Well, they don't leave the house. I say, what do? I tell them to get a job. And I'm like, wow, that's a big leap to go from I can't leave the house to get a full-time job or go volunteer full-time. Can you drop by? Can we see the world as people in grief see us? I remember someone saying to me once how, the isolation is people not seeing the world through their eyes. And us to ask people in grief what it's like for them instead of trying to cheer them up and fix them, because they're not broken.
Yeah.
And you mentioned in the introduction, I have a grief educator certificate program, and it's probably mostly about 50% therapists. And they all say it's shocking around the world. Therapists often don't have a mandatory grief class.
Yeah, I have zero training in grief.
Yeah, it's just sort of like, well, you're alive. Clearly, we're going to know grief. And everyone gets so surprised when they realize, wait, there's actual tools, there's actual techniques. So we have about 50% therapists, and we have a lot of coaches, and we have a lot of first responders and nurses and people who are turning their pain into purpose. And people don't realize most bereavement groups in the world are run by non-professionals. And so one of the things is that so many of us are taught, what's your 3 interventions? And then we get to grief, and it's like, oh, wait, you want me to start with listening? You don't want me to help fix? Wait, I'm not trying to cheer them up? Wait, you want me to sit? Am I going to get paid for that? I need interventions, all that.
Well, you said earlier about the only way out is through. And you use it's not even a metaphor, it's a real thing in the book about how buffalo run into a storm because they get through it quicker. Is that right? I mean, so it's literal. It's not a metaphor, but what a great metaphor for grief.
And we run from grief. And instead of going through it, it stays 3 feet behind us for our whole life, unresolved, running the show, just a mild river of misery behind us.
Let's talk a little bit about that. Like, is there such thing as unhealthy grieving? You talk about practical grieving where a person doesn't cry or they might not seem sad, but how do you differentiate between emotional avoidance that can lead to that kind of long-lasting, complicated bereavement that's always behind you, like you were just describing, versus practical grieving, like what's going through versus what's avoiding?
Yeah, let's first talk about practical grievers because it feels like another species. Practical grievers are the folks who go to the funeral and they are sad and then they get back to life. And a lot of us look at them and go, ooh, it's going to hit them hard someday. They're avoiding it. Now, they seem fine. They seem completely fine. When we look, one of the things that distinguishes them is they're practical about everything. They're practical about the breakup. They're practical about the divorce. They're practical about the move. And people go, oh, I think I have a client. And I go, no, you don't. Practical grievers don't go to therapy. Practical grievers don't swim in feelings. Like practical grievers are friends and family members who say, well, I'm glad people are paying you to talk, but the reality is I have this thing called friends. I don't need a therapist. And we think they don't have enough feelings, and they think we have way too many. And it's really hard to not make them wrong and just understand it's a different style of grieving.
Yeah.
Now, we all can think of practical grievers in our life. I have quite a few in mind. I mean, there is one of the folks in my world, one of my children's godmothers, the loveliest, caring, most amazing person. I mean, I can remember a couple of Father's Day after my son died. I was talking, she called me up to wish me a happy Father's Day. And I said, oh, it's so hard. And she goes, why? What did Richard do? Meaning my older son.
Right.
And I went, Richard's fine. It's Father's Day and David died. And she went, oh, that. And I went, yep, that's still here.
Right.
But that's just her. Now, The thing is, when I was across the country and I heard news that my son had died and I needed someone to go to his place and figure out and help me know what was going on, oh my gosh, I have so many friends that would have fell apart and couldn't do it. She was the person to go.
Yeah.
She was the person who was going to go and help me know what's going on and figure things out. That's her. Now, getting back to your question, when we're avoiding stuff, people will come in and go, I don't know if I'm really grieving. I don't know if I'm doing this, or this is haunting me, or I'm having trouble. Practical grievers just aren't haunted by anything. They're like, well, at least they're not haunted by feelings. But you can feel in avoiders, there's a percolation going on that they sense and we can sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking about someone in my own life who, my guess, he might appear to be a practical griever, but he had all these like personality changes. And to me, it felt like, oh, you're struggling and this is unresolved, unprocessed grief. And it's just coming out in these other ways because you don't have the tools to process it emotionally, not because you actually are a practical griever and you're really doing okay.
Right. I know someone else who, they were a Vietnam vet and they went through a lot of trauma and they've never done any work on it. And horrible addiction, where as if it was a practical griever, they probably wouldn't be going through that. He it's too painful and he's avoiding it. And he can't talk about it. He's the one that gets choked up if something gets mentioned and he has to leave the room. Well, you can see him overcome with feelings.
Yeah.
Your practical griever just isn't overcome with feelings.
Yeah, they're just really okay.
They're okay.
Yeah. Well, let's talk more about meaning. So is this something that we just like sit around and wait for it to happen? I mean, the name of the book is Finding Meaning. So how do we find it? How do we seek it out? How do we get there?
Well, I think as we excavate the pain, I try to help people know a few things. When we think about meaning, we often think about, oh, you want me to start a charity? Wait, I have to do a 5K run in honor of my loved one. What do I have to do? We always think of the big things. And meaning often occurs in the small moments. And meaning can be lots of different things. Meaning can be we're changed by how they lived. Maybe we're changed by their death. Maybe we want to make the world better for other people so that they don't have to go through what our loved one did. Maybe they are so moved by what happened that it changes them. So there's a lot of ways, and they can be as internal as they are external.
Yeah.
And just, there's a million little small meanings. I mean, I share in the book a woman who buys a set of stamps, and it was her father's favorite TV show was on the stamp. And she doesn't frame them. She uses them as stamps. And whenever she mails a letter, she has this sweet moment of connection with her father. So, meaning is in these little tiny moments.
Do you mind sharing an example with you and your son? He died of a drug overdose, correct?
Correct.
And then you've done some work with other people that are kind of going down that path. Will you share that as an example?
Sure. One thing that's changed in our world is in 12-step programs, in a lot of the addiction world, we used to talk about relapse is part of recovery. It's just really normal. You're going to relapse. And relapse now is so dangerous because of the drugs.
Yeah.
Fentanyl, heroin, they're all just so deadly. So I've taken some young folks from local sobriety centers and I bring them to the funeral home where my son was, and I show them the video from the funeral. And it kind of at first looks like any funeral video. It's him young and playful and all that. And I tell them about him being adopted and, being drug exposed. And then all of a sudden, they see him older and they see him in spots outside a 12-step meeting where they go and they begin to identify them. And all of a sudden, we go up to his grave and I say, this is another face of relapse. Just to help them really understand what we're dealing with and what the costs are.
And would it be fair to say that's one of the ways you have found meaning?
That's one of the ways. That's one of the ways.
Yeah. Yeah. It's incredibly powerful. You talk at one point in the book about whether kids should go to funerals, that lots of parents thinking that they're protecting their children's feelings will keep their kids away, but that these rites and rituals are really important to the grieving process. So should kids go to funerals?
Well, it's very nuanced. I mean, the first thing I would say is I always have to defer to the family. The family gets to always choose, but I try to give them some information. And I will often share that as parents, we want to give our children choices. What a nice idea so that they have agency. But children don't really know or understand what they're choosing. And I have, seen people over the years say to their little 5-year-old daughter, do you want to go to grandpa's funeral? No. Well, we're not going to make you. And of course she doesn't want to go to a funeral. She doesn't want grandpa to be dead. Or I've seen teenagers who have enormous guilt because they didn't go to a funeral. I see all these people later in life. I talk to a lot of people who feel more upset about not being at the funeral than people who were traumatized by the funeral. Yeah. Once in a blue moon, I see that person who was traumatized. And then I will tell you, like someone said to me once, should my child see the dead body in the casket? I don't think they should. And I go, well, that's really up to you. And I said, are you going to look? And she said, no, I would freak out. I would freak out, David. And I thought, well, of course, it's not going to be good for your child. We all have our collective grief background of ways we've been taught. And so I often talk about the idea of I would probably bring them. And I would explain to them, I would say, do you know how we gathered last year for Grandpa's birthday? When we sing happy birthday, that's another way we say, I love you. And we all gathered for Grandpa's birthday. We're going to get together one last time for Grandpa. And that's the funeral. And I so want you to be a part of it. And I would make sure they have someone who can answer questions. I'd make sure someone that can get them to the bathroom and all that, and that they're prepared for what they're going to see as much as they can be. And I think it tends to work out well with a little preparation. And, sometimes parents will say, I can't force them. And I go, don't you force them to go to school every day? Aren't you forcing them to eat whole foods these days?
Right.
I've seen you force that broccoli down. We do have some rules.
Well, and I also think about the very human tendency to struggle with uncertainty. So I remember I was talking to a child psychologist friend. I only work with adults. I don't know much about developmental psychology. And I was asking for a friend who was asking what they should tell their kids about like a cancer diagnosis. It was something like that. And I was sort of surprised by her answer. But one of the things she pointed out is that, first of all, kids are smarter than you think they are, and they know something's going on. And in the absence of information, their brains, that negativity bias, their brains are going to fill in probably something far more catastrophic than what's even going on. And that if you can give them the information at a developmentally appropriate level, it's actually much more beneficial than just not saying anything at all and leaving them sitting in that ambiguity. And so I imagine that could be very similar when we talk about a funeral and someone's death.
Absolutely. And when we, from my end of life world and hospital work and hospice and palliative care work, I can tell you, we've seen people who have said, you can't see Grandma. She's in the ICU with tons of tubes and she's, there's a machine and it would be too upsetting. And we have those kids draw pictures of what Grandma looks like. And they show tubes going in Grandma's eyeballs and a machine on top of the bed crushing. It's so much worse.
Yeah.
It's so much
that's
worse.
A perfect example. Yeah. But now these funerals are not about closure. You have thoughts about this word closure.
No, I don't believe in closure. I don't think we ever close the door on our loved one who died.
Yeah.
I think the modern media has tried to sometimes let's find closure because we want to put a button on our story that they found closure. We want people to find closure because it makes us comfortable. Oh, if you find some closure, that would make me so much better. And I think sometimes if people are wishing for closure for us, they're really wishing for peace. Mm-hmm. And peace is so much nicer of a word than closure. And we also know psychologically, we have continuing bonds with people who have died. I always say to people, don't give death more power than it has. It doesn't have the power to end love, to end the relationship.
Well, you have a book about all the people in the room. What was the title of that
Visions,
book?
Trips, and Crowded Rooms. Who would you see before you die? And it was interesting. I did this when I was doing a lot of end-of-life work, and I would see people who were dying, seeing their loved ones coming to greet them.
Yeah.
And so many times it would get discounted, even by family members who didn't want to think of Grandma as going crazy and hallucinating. And so I was curious, what's the difference between hallucinations and deathbed visions? And I ended up interviewing doctors, nurses, clinicians, therapists, first responders, because I knew they would be more objective about how the dead come to greet the dying. So it's a fascinating book. It really, it's kind of in a strange way, just an uplifting book because you realize, what if we do continue?
It's fascinating. And I'm definitely not religious. I don't think of myself as particularly spiritual, but after my mom died, I had this experience that I swear it was a dream. It happened while I was sleeping, but it was not a dream. It was a visitation. We were in a car and she was just looking at me and she didn't say anything, but she was emanating this like love and peace, just sort of glowing. And I somehow knew she had come to say, like, I have shed all of my worldly trauma, all the things that made it hard for me to show up in the ways that you needed me to show up. Like, I'm good now. I'm okay. And then when I was listening to this podcast, a lot of people were describing very similar experiences. And it really brought me a lot of comfort in terms of being less afraid to die. When you think maybe there's a little bit more to, I don't know, consciousness than just our body and our heartbeat. And it sounds like that's a big part of what's in that book too. I need to read that book. Yeah.
It's fascinating. It's a fascinating read. I really was curious as we were working with so many people who were dying and had deathbed visions. We came across none who had a bad experience. Like no one was greeted by their enemy. Even there was one person who was so afraid her husband had beat her. There was a lot of domestic violence. She was afraid he had died and he would show up.
Wow.
And he didn't, and she died peacefully. So, there's something about it's a very comforting experience.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to put that book on the top of my TBR pile. Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you think would be helpful or important for our listeners to know?
I think I would just end with this concept of what we run from pursues us and what we face transforms us.
Oh, I love that. I love
to
that.
Encourage people with that.
That is a perfect spot to end. Thank you so much for doing this. This was such a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it. If people want to find you and find your books and all the things about you, where should they go?
Well, the easiest spot is grief.com, but I'm also on all social media. You can find me at I am David Kessler. David Kessler was already taken, so I had to be I am David Kessler. And so I'm on all the platforms, and I've got Tender Hearts is our online grief group for people. And, it's a large grief group. People can be up front talking, or they can be in the background with their camera off. And I have the grief certificate program. All those can be found at grief.com.
Fabulous. And I actually went there to find a list of grief counselors to help somebody with referrals. So yes, it is an incredible website with so many
once people have gone through my training, we list them so people can work with people who have been trained by me.
Yeah, wonderful. All right. Thank you so much. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for listening to my interview with the amazing David Kessler. I'm here with Debbie for our co-host post. Debbie, what were your thoughts on my conversation with David?
It was such a great conversation. David Kessler's story is really remarkable. I was so struck by his history and then losing his son, that experience. So I learned a lot and it was really interesting to listen to it. But for me, it had a personal note because I haven't shared this on the podcast yet, but my stepfather died over the summer and he's pretty much one of my parents because he married my mom when I was 12. And, my family's been going through this grief process that he describes. And especially my mom, of course, who was married to him and who lived with him. And so to hear this conversation, I think just really validated some of what I and other people in my family have experienced recently. And it felt lovely to listen to it and hopeful.
I will say, Debbie, his book truly is just one of the most beautiful, helpful books. I mean, after I read it, I have bought it for anyone I know who's gone through a loss. And I think sometimes when people are right in the acute phase of a loss, the last thing they can do is read or even listen to an audiobook. But I think for you or for your mom or anyone else in your family, I cannot recommend it enough. And I just think this whole idea of finding meaning in the wake of loss and how that is really the crux of post-traumatic growth and how it can be something very, very small and seemingly insignificant or something not so small. And, what an impact that can have in terms of the healing process.
Yeah. Well, I have a copy of the book for my mom. And when I first gave it to her at your recommendation, Jill, I think she was at that stage where she couldn't focus. She didn't want books yet. But I think the time is good now because it's been a few months, and I think the grief is still there, but things have evolved over the course of time. And one thing I really appreciated about the conversation you had with him is just about, we talk about the stages of grief, and there's something really helpful about that, but the way that it looks, it's not the same for every person. And there's different ways that these grief processes show up for different people. And so it's really super helpful. And I think that it's a good reminder to me to go back and take a look at this book because I know you really loved it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I realized that, this was David Kessler. He is like the biggest grief expert literally in the world. And there was just so much to talk about that we didn't even spend a ton of time on the actual finding meaning part.
Yeah.
And, and I think that was still very worthwhile that people got to hear from him about the stages of grief and all the other different things that we discussed, but that for any listener who's kind of craving a little bit more depth, specifically on the finding meaning part, then I would definitely recommend the book. And I actually listened to it rather than read it, and he reads it. And, listening to our interview, you can hear how like soft spoken and kind and warm he is. So it just felt like a hug the whole time I was listening. And as I said in the interview, I listened to it at a time where I was not experiencing any acute loss, and I still cried my way through. And it wasn't crying in a sad way. It was just so moving in general.
Yeah, I love that. I felt that way about this conversation too. It just was like really nice to listen to it.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad you brought him on.
And here's a little tidbit. After I hit stop on the record because I had mentioned my new podcast to David, he gave me a suggestion for a guest, and I reached out to her immediately and she said yes. And so cool. I have this, which that felt really cool to have David Kessler be like, oh, hey, I have an idea for you for a podcast guest. I was like, oh, thanks. So that like really meant a lot to me.
Oh, very sweet.
Well, thanks, everybody, for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and please consider sharing it with anyone you know who is experiencing grief and loss. Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.